Welcome once again to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This will be lecture number 36, and in this lecture and the next one, we will explore several central themes in medieval European political development. This lecture will focus particularly on England and France, while the next one will look at Ireland, Iberia, Italy, Germany, at some other regions in Europe. Now, we've talked about the material conditions of life in high medieval Europe. We've talked about the social conditions of life. So now we will be asking questions about how these people organized themselves politically and institutionally. Now, in order to cover a lot of space and a lot of time, we're going to follow certain basic themes, 4 of them in particular. One of them, for example, will be the development or the failure to develop the territorial integrity of the state. Where did these political entities actually wind up on the map? A second theme that we'll follow is the elaboration or the failure to elaborate strong institutions of central government. Where did they emerge? Why did they emerge? Where did they not emerge? Why not? A third theme will be the expansion of governmental activity. Now, we can look at that in a couple of different ways. One thing that we'll notice, not so much in this lecture as in the next one, is that in the Celtic world and Scandinavian and the Slavic world, considerable areas that were not, as it were, on the map in the Carolingian period come on the map and, of course, remain on the map until today. So that's one way we can think about an expansion of government activity. Another way we can think about the expansion of government activity is to talk about the growing size, the growing complexity, the growing sophistication of governmental institutions within particular states. In other words, quite simply, government became more present for more people more of the time. Fourth and finally, though we'll say less about this subject than about the others, though it is an important subject, is the question of changes in the social composition of the governing classes. All right, let's begin with England. We left off with England some time ago when the small early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were just about to have a rather long and rather unhappy encounter with the Vikings. We can pick up our story there and then take it through several conquests, through foreign entanglements, through dynastic instability, in other words, through a lot of very difficult challenges which the English faced, and yet we'll arrive at the end of the 13th century at a fairly well-organized and governed state. Now, it must be said, England is relatively small and considerably more homogeneous than many other European states. That made political development, coherent political development, something less of a challenge than elsewhere. It doesn't make it easy and it didn't make it inevitable, but it made it somewhat easier. We'll have occasion to see when we talk, for instance, about France or about Germany, that complexity there was actually a considerable retarding factor in political development. Well, the little kingdoms of the so-called heptarchy often produced one leading member, but never really produced a national monarchy. Now, as the kingdoms of the heptarchy succeeded one after another, England then encountered the Vikings. First in 793 when they attacked Lindisfarne Island. We mentioned that in an earlier lecture. And then across most of the 9th century, there were sporadic attacks, now here, now there. Quite unpredictable, damaging but not decisive in their impact. In 865, the so-called Great Army, having been defeated in France, crossed the Channel, attacked England, and actually settled down to the business of conquering the country. In these difficult circumstances, England found a very effective ruler, a very effective king in Alfred the Great, who reigned from 871 until 899. Alfred began in Wessex, in the southwest of the country, a rally that by his death had moved the Viking, mainly Danish, these Vikings that we're talking about are mainly Danes, it had moved their frontier right up to the Thames Valley. In other words, most of southern England had been liberated. Over the course of the 10th century, Alfred's successors continued to move the frontier farther and farther north into the Danelaw, the part of England that was under Scandinavian control, that was centered on the city of Jorvik. We know that city as York today. It was Roman Eboracum. So actually York bears to this day a Viking name. In the late 10th century, political consolidation in Scandinavia led freebooting warriors to begin attacking England again. Here we have evidence of the expansion of government activity in terms of formal states being organized, particularly in Denmark and in Norway. And some of these Viking characters decided to beat a hasty retreat and go elsewhere, and a number of them began in the last decades of the 10th and the very beginning of the 11th century to attack England once more. England was conquered in 1014 by Sweyn Forkbeard, who was succeeded by his son Canute in 1016. Canute reigned in England until 1035 and then was succeeded in turn by his own sons until 1042, when the son of the last Anglo-Saxon king returned. Now at this point, Edward the Confessor, the king who came back, who reigned in England from 1042 to 1066, had no heir. He had taken a vow of chastity. We aren't told what his wife thought about that vow, but in any case, the point is that he had no heir. He seems at different times to have recognized the claims of Harold of Wessex, who was the leader of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, of William the Bastard, the Duke of Normandy, and then we have a complicating factor in that King Harald Hardrada, who was the king of Denmark, claimed England in succession to Canute. So the situation in England during the years when Edward the Confessor was the king was very complicated indeed. Now Harold Wessex, immediate on the death of Edward the Confessor in 1066, Harold Hardrada invaded from England, invaded from the north, invaded northeastern England. Harold Wessex marched north and defeated him, only to learn that William the Conqueror of Normandy was actually landing on the southern coast. Harold Wessex made a big mistake. He marched south very quickly. He could have waited a while and rested his troops and perhaps rallied his forces, increased the size of his forces. He marched south very quickly, met William the Conqueror at Hastings in October of 1066, and was decisively defeated. His army was defeated. He was left dead on the battlefield. This was England's famous Norman conquest, when the Duke of Normandy conquered England. But the point that I want to register with you is that that conquest is a culmination of 2.5 centuries of Norman, that is, Northmen, attacks on England. And that attempt had been made to conquer England in 865. England had in fact been conquered in 1014 and was conquered again in 1066. So this was actually a rather long tradition and not a single one-off event that happened in 1066. Now, what we're talking about really, though, is the territorial integrity of the state at this moment. So let's say that when William the Conqueror comes to England from Normandy, he retained his interest in Normandy. This ushered in a centuries-long English territorial involvement with France. Henceforth, and for a very long time indeed, the kings of England also hold territories, varying territories, as we'll see, in France. Now, William was succeeded by 2 sons in succession. The second of these, Henry I, who reigned from 1100 to 1135, died without a male heir. The Anglo-Norman elite would not accept his daughter as his heir. As a result, a grandson of William the Conqueror on the French side was chosen. He came over to England in 1135. King Stephen I was his name. He reigned for 19 years until 1154, and then he died without an heir. As a result, in 1154, Henry II, Henry of Anjou, Henry the son of that daughter of Henry I, who was not recognized as England's ruler, became the King of England. Now, in his shortly before he became the King of England, he had also married the famous Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, I mention that because Henry II, Henry of Anjou, is the Count of Anjou in his own right, and he controls lands in Maine, the Touraine, in Poitou, and he has claims upon Brittany. He controls Normandy through his mother. He controls Aquitaine and a substantial chunk of the south through his wife, and he becomes the King of England. He has, in other words, what historians call the Angevin Empire. He's from Anjou. He is an Angevin. His Angevin Empire is about 60% of France. So now you have the anomalous situation that a French prince has become the King of England, and as King of England, and in addition to being King of England, controls about 60% of France. Now, Henry was succeeded by his sons Richard Lionheart and John, called by some of his contemporaries Soft Sword or Lackland, because he wasn't a very good warrior and he wound up lacking an awful lot of land, like all of that land that had belonged to his father. But we'll have more to say about that in just a second. The point is that John provoked, foolishly, a quarrel with the King of France, who was actually kind of laying in wait for him. And as a result, the King of France went to war against John's continental possessions, and swallowed up, sort of at one gulp, a great portion of England's continental holdings. Well, from one point of view, that clarified the situation for England. England didn't have this vast swathe of territories in France to worry about anymore. From another point of view, however, this actually produced a situation where the English felt aggrieved, and over much of the next several centuries would continuously feel that they had a right to vindicate their old claims to various bits of French territory. Through all of this, however, the basic shape of England didn't change very much. Now, it's true that in this period, the English kings began to claim overlordship in Wales and Scotland. But it's also true that they never exerted full authority in either of those regions in the period that we're concerned with here today. So, in the first place then, this little kingdom of England basically held its shape despite being attacked again and again and again, and despite this rather long and curious dalliance with France. The situation in France itself is much easier to describe, fortunately. The last Carolingians, and after 987, their Capetian successors, had controlled not much more than the Ile-de-France, the island of France, the little area in the center of France focused on the city of Paris. Now, that area is strategically situated. It's on the Seine River. It's near trading areas. It's near great religious establishments. And so it brought some advantages with it. It did, this strategic point in the Ile-de-France. But the Capetians were particularly gifted at governing it well and using it as a basis to expand their authority elsewhere in France. Now, when French princes started involving themselves in English affairs, the Capetian kings learned how to meddle in the continental holdings of those English kings. Louis VII and Philip II of France, for example, were absolute masters at driving Henry II of England crazy by interfering with his sons, who were, in service to their father, supposed to be helping him to govern the Angevin holdings in France. The French created all sorts of distractions for the English. Then, as I mentioned a moment ago, King Philip II, who rules in France from 1180 until 1223, defeated John and secured an enormous portion of France for the French monarchy. As the 13th century wore on, the French monarchy extended its authority in the southeast by leading or by promoting campaigns against religious heretics in that part of France who lived in areas centering on the town of Albi. So the point is that the eventual emergence of a French territorial state is also visible across the period that we're talking about. But it's important to emphasize what a complex thing France is. The great French political leader Charles de Gaulle once said it's impossible to govern a country with 325 kinds of cheese. And he was pointing simply to the enormous complexity of this thing that is France. Well, despite military and dynastic turmoil, the core of England was well and remarkably consistently governed. The conquerors didn't come to plunder and to destroy, but to rule, and perhaps indeed to profit from ruling, perhaps indeed even to rule. England's Anglo-Saxon kings already had some very important centralizing tools at their disposal, for example. Key nobles, whom they called thanes, came to court, provided service to the king, received appointments for the king, provided advice to the king. Local officials, the shire reeves, which passed through Norman French as sheriff, the shire reeves were royal appointees, represented the kings well in the shires of England. The division of England into shires took place basically in the 10th century, sort of administrative districts. The king could summon all free men to serve in his militia. He didn't always summon them all, but he had the right to summon all free men. The king could always collect some taxes in England, and during the Viking period, they extended this prerogative with Danegelds. That literally means Dane money. Taxes, or protection money, if you will, that was collected to buy off the Vikings when it was inopportune to fight them. Well, once the English kings got the habit of collecting Danegels occasionally, they began to collect Danegels regularly, and they began to collect Danegels even after there weren't any Danish problems. They simply turned it into a regular tax. William the Conqueror and his successors retained and advanced this system. When William came in 1066, he had no reason to upset things. He does innovate in some respects. For example, in 1087, he carried out the massive Doomsday Survey, producing a remarkable document, a remarkable book, the most comprehensive accounting of the human and material resources of a kingdom until the U.S. Census of 1790. There was nothing like it again for a very long time. Well, quite simply, William had conquered England. He wanted to know what's out there. What is it that I've got? What did I win? So he conducts this survey by sending investigators right round the country to ask questions and to count and to enumerate everything from mills to pigs and chickens to people. Henry I began the long evolution of the English exchequer. Henry I, William's son and successor from 1100 to 1135, the exchequer, so called from the checkerboard cloth on which the accounts, the royal accounts, were reckoned. The chief financial branch of the English government is to this day called the exchequer, and its long history begins with Henry I, putting royal finances on a secure foundation. Henry also began sending out itinerant justices, justices who in effect extended the royal court throughout the realm. Now, one can ask, is this not in a way analogous to Charlemagne's Missi Dominici? And the answer is yes, of course it is. Was there a direct influence? That's possible. But the fact is that we now see measures like this being introduced in England. The royal court is extending itself throughout the realm. Royal law is extending throughout the realm. Now, as these royal courts gradually drew in sort of more and more and more serious business and rendered judgments in more and more and more kinds of cases, the foundations were created in England for a common law, for a single law that would be applied throughout the country. By the time of King John of England, the English barons were increasingly distressed at the evolution of royal institutions over which they felt they had little control. That business that I mentioned that we would pursue not in great detail can be just mentioned here, namely the governing class. One of the things that Henry I, but then particularly Henry II and also John had begun doing was bringing middle-class men, urban men, and as we turn the corner to the 13th century, even men trained in universities, into their royal administration. Rather than holding all the, or reserving perhaps all of the key positions for members of the aristocracy, they began to draw in excuse me, they began to draw in members of the middle classes who were likely to be much more loyal to the king because as the king had made them, he could unmake them. But I don't want to suggest that the English government had lost its aristocratic character by the year 1200, but it was perhaps changing ever so slightly. Well, anyway, the English barons were not very pleased at the direction the English government was taking, and they forced King John in the year 1215 to affix his signature to the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Called the Great Charter not because it's great in the sense that it's wonderful, but great because it's big. It's a great big piece of parchment on which the charter was written out. The document insisted that the king was not above the law. Perhaps most fundamental, that's what it asserted. The king is not above the law. The king is answerable to the law like everyone else. The barons also insisted that the king stop abusing what we call feudalism. Now, what they were objecting to was the king's exercise of some of his prerogatives, some of his rights as ruler, some of the things that he felt he could do because he was the king. Well, this brings us to the subject of feudalism, so let's put it on the table, mainly so we can take it back off the table. It used to be assumed that one could easily speak of medieval government in terms of a nice, tidy feudal pyramid. Now, about the only place you hear that any longer is, in maybe newspapers or in high school history books or places like that. One never finds serious scholars talking much about feudal pyramids, feudal systems, or even much about feudalism any longer. Now, the idea of a feudal pyramid, was you had a society where the king was at the top, and then he had his vassals, and his vassals had vassals, and those vassals had vassals, and so on, sort of down, arraying out pyramid style, and then presumably all the peasants were just squashed under the pyramid someplace. They didn't quite fit in this system. Now, it's perfectly true that there were lords and there were vassals in the Middle Ages. And it's perfectly true that vassals did swear homage and fealty. They swore, in other words, not to harm the interests of their lord. It's perfectly true as well that vassals agreed to provide auxilium et consilium, advice and counsel. Advice and aid, advice and aid. This is what the texts of the time say. Now, advice suit to court, that they could come to court to advise the king, to serve as the king's natural advisors, or indeed whoever the feudal lord might be, and service. Generally speaking, military service, but not always. People provided a wide array of different kinds of service. Now, in return for their advice and assistance, vassals were often given something of value, called a fief. In Latin, a feudum, which is where the word feudalism comes from in the first place. And a vassal was also provided sometimes with moral and legal protection by a more powerful person. In this way, it's a patron-client system like many another that we have seen, for example, like the one that obtained among the Romans. It's also true that feudalism played a certain role in royal governance. We've seen all the way back to the Carolingians that royal vassals performed important government jobs. John had outrageously abused his feudal prerogatives. What does this mean? Well, concretely, if, for example, your vassal died and his son was a child, you had a right to take over those lands until the son came of age, and then you invested him with them. Well, John had a bad habit of just not investing those sons with the lands, of just keeping the lands in his own hands. If your vassal died and had only a daughter, you had the right to arrange a suitable marriage for that daughter so that there would be a vassal on those lands who could perform service. John had a habit, again, of holding those lands in his hands and thereby manipulating the system. So it was a system they all understood, but John was sort of tinkering with it a bit. So the barons, when they forced John to sign Magna Carta, wanted him, in a sense, to play by the rules, wanted all of them to have to play by the same rules, wanted the king to agree that there were rules and that he was no less bound by them than anyone else. But the objection that I have, that most historians have to talking about feudalism, is that if we think of the several centuries of medieval history, and if we think of a geographical range running from sort of Ireland to Moscow and running from Scandinavia to the south of Italy, there was never a feudal system. There was never a thing called feudalism. The word itself is invented in the 17th century. It's not a medieval word. There was never a system that all medieval people would have understood, and it was never the only way that relationships between powerful men of the ruling class were regulated, nor was it ever the only way in which governmental services were provided. It was an element of medieval life. That's true, but it was not medieval government. One cannot, therefore, generalize it the way it sometimes has been in the past. Now, 13th century England posed a couple of pretty great political and institutional questions. Fundamentally, how can political decisions be made without recourse to violence? John had been forced to sign the Magna Carta. Who gets to participate in decision-making processes? Now, it was always assumed that the king would take advice in his council, that there were persons who would come to advise him, persons he wanted to advise. Remember we talked about the Carolingians creating the appearance of consensus? Great barons obviously wanted to control the royal council, and through it the king. The king, of course, wanted to stack the great council, and through it manage the country. In 1265 and then again in 1295, there were meetings in which powerful nobles plus higher members of the clergy, plus prominent but not necessarily aristocratic local men, and some burghers from the greater towns of England, came together to talk, parlement in the then dominant French, and they gave their name to an institution, a place where people talked together, Parliament. The English Parliament existed by the end of the 13th century, to be sure, but it had been born accidentally. And as an institution, it was not yet clear what its powers would be, who would attend it, how often it would meet. But the point had been made that there was a community of the realm, communitas regni in Latin, a group of people who imagined themselves to represent the country naturally to the king. Now, this is not democratic yet, by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a notion, then, that there is a natural group of people who advise the king. Now, if we'd looked a little bit more closely at the household of the English kings, we would have detected the extension of personal domestic responsibilities to the kingdom as a whole. How do you get a government? Well, this is also true of France. Let's just take a few examples drawn from the royal household. There was an officer who kept the king's treasure. Initially, it was a chest that was kept in his bedchamber, perhaps at the foot of his bed. This was the origin of the treasury that sort of stored up the revenues of the kingdom, as opposed to, distinct from, the personal income of the monarch. In other words, money that flowed to him as the king is different from money that flowed to him as a person who held certain lands and certain privileges. So the origins of the treasury was basically the person who looked after the king's personal possessions and gradually came to look after the wealth of England. The king had clerics who handled his correspondence and prepared formal documents for him. English kings from the 12th century on were routinely literate. They were irregularly literate before that. Gradually, some of these men became less personal servants of the king and more public officers of the realm, and thus was born the chancery, the writing office and the record-keeping office of the English government. A royal government will move about from time to time. It goes about the country to show itself to the people, to check on local conditions. Well, there's a great transport officer in the royal house, the comes stabuli, the count of the stable, who becomes the constable. And gradually he becomes not merely the transport officer of the royal house, but in a way its chief military and police officer. Well, we could go on and on and on like this, deriving the offices of state from the royal household. Basically, household government eventually became national government. Persons who served the king privately began to separate away from the king, sometimes, for example, in Westminster in London or in Paris, to settle down in permanent offices and there to do the business of the country. Now, in France, the question was really over what territories this system would extend. In other words, the expansion of household government to state government was true there, as it was in England. Initially, as I suggested, the French kings ruled not much more than the Ile-de-France. Slowly but surely, we have seen how the French kings, by defeating the English, by carrying out battles against religious dissenters in the south of France, began to extend their territorial reach. Now, one great advantage for France, first of all, is that in 987, a man, Hugh Capet, comes to the French throne, and his family reigns until 1328. 3.5 centuries by one family. Great stability. And that family, moreover, produced a saint, a very revered king, Louis IX, reigned from 1226 to 1270, a long reign his, but a saint of the church, great prestige for the French monarchy. We'll see when we talk about Germany in our next lecture that this dynastic stability is a factor of real consequence, though the English didn't have it and did not fail for all of that. The innovation in the French system was that after lands had been conquered from the English, the French kings didn't assign them out to vassals as fiefs. They assigned them usually to members of the royal family in very large chunks called appanage. And these areas then were ruled over by an extension of royal government, sort of direct royal government was introduced into these territories, quite effective royal government in many ways, and the French kings didn't have to worry about a group of barons like those in England who forced King John to affix his signature to the Magna Carta. The French kings, in other words, used non-feudal policies, if we want to look at it this way, as soon as they were strong enough to do so. Now, the result of French policy was that royal government was stronger than England's because in England a significant local elite had existed and played key roles ever since Anglo-Saxon times. The French didn't permit that same kind of local elite to arise, but then France is larger. It is more ethnically complex. It is more socially complex. It is more economically complex. So it was less cohesive than England. So England and France were very different, but each had developed essentially the modern territorial limits of its state. Each had developed a reasonably effective central government. But this shows us two models of government. One, with a king increasingly checked and limited, or at least potentially checked and limited, by parliamentary institutions. Though again, we can say this because our hindsight is so clear. And another where it appears that the monarchy is working its way away from mediating institutions and from sharing power. But we ought not to assume then that either the French or the English model is normative for Europe as a whole. When we turn next time to Germany, to Iberia, to Italy, we'll see a number of very different models of political development. They have some things in common with England and France, and they differ as well. What we're going to see is complexity and richness in the political life of Europe. But perhaps these basic points on France and England will have helped us to launch that discussion, and we'll carry it forward in our next lecture.